The sun blazed brightly in the sky, casting a warm glow over the bustling city square. It was one of those picture-perfect days where everything seemed alive. The chatter of tourists, the rhythmic clatter of footsteps on cobblestones, and the faint hum of street musicians playing cheerful tunes. The air smelled sweet, mingling with the aroma of freshly baked pastries from nearby cafes and the occasional waft of flowers sold by vendors along the sidewalks. People moved about in clusters, some pointing excitedly at historic statues, while others paused to snap photos that would later fill their social media feeds. Among the throngs of visitors stood Ryan, a young man with tousled hair and an adventurous spark in his eyes. He had traveled thousands of miles to explore this famous city, eager to soak up every bit of its charm. His backpack hung loosely off one shoulder, stuffed with maps, snacks, and souvenirs he'd picked up during his trip. Today, though, something felt different. After hours of wandering through museums and admiring centuries-old architecture, Ryan found himself growing restless. The predictable rhythm of sightseeing wasn't enough anymore. He wanted excitement, something out of the ordinary. As he strolled across the square, his gaze landed on a striking figure standing tall near a towering monument, a guardsman dressed in full ceremonial uniform. The soldier's presence commanded attention. His polished boots gleamed under the sunlight. His hat sat perfectly aligned atop his head, and his posture exuded discipline. Not even the tiniest twitch betrayed any sign of movement. To Ryan, it almost seemed like the guardsman wasn't human but part of the monument itself. Ryan tilted his head curiously, watching as other tourists approached cautiously to take pictures. Some giggled nervously when they got too close, only to retreat quickly once they realized the guardsman wouldn't react. A mischievous grin slowly spread across Ryan's face. An idea began forming in his mind, an idea that made his pulse race with anticipation. What if I do something unexpected? He muttered under his breath. His friends, who were trailing behind him, exchanged wary glances. "Ryan, don't," one of them cautioned, sensing trouble brewing. But Ryan waved them off, brushing aside their concerns with a laugh. "Relax, it's just a bit of fun," he said, already scanning the area for inspiration. That's when he spotted an ice cream cart parked nearby. Without giving it another thought, he jogged over and bought a cone, choosing the messiest flavor available. Returning to his spot, he eyed the guardsman again, his heart pounding with adrenaline-fueled excitement. The crowd around him buzzed with energy, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Ryan took a deep breath, gripping the ice cream cone tightly in his hand. For a fleeting moment, doubt flickered in his mind. Was this really such a good idea? But before he could second-guess himself, he stepped forward, shouting loudly enough to draw everyone's attention. "Hey, catch!" he called out, tossing the ice cream straight toward the unsuspecting guardsman. Time seemed to slow as the creamy dessert sailed through the air, leaving a trail of sticky sweetness behind. And then came the crash, literally and figuratively, as the ice cream hit its target, splattering across the pristine uniform. Gasps erupted from the crowd, followed by an eerie silence that settled over the square like a heavy blanket. Ryan froze, suddenly realizing the enormity of what he'd done. What had started as a harmless prank now felt anything but funny. The moment the ice cream struck the guardsman's uniform, a collective gasp rippled through the crowd. People froze in place, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some clapped hands over their mouths, while others instinctively took a step back, as if trying to distance themselves from the chaos that had just unfolded. The creamy dessert dripped down the soldier's chest, leaving a sticky trail on the immaculate fabric of his ceremonial attire. Despite the mess, the guardsman didn't move an inch. His face remained stoic, his posture unwavering, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Ryan, however, wasn't prepared for the reaction that followed. At first, he chuckled nervously, expecting maybe a glare or a sharp word from the guardsman. After all, it was just a silly prank, right? But when no response came, his laughter faded into an awkward silence. He glanced around at the crowd, hoping someone might share in his amusement. But instead, he was met with disapproving stares. Parents ushered their children away, shaking their heads in disappointment, while other tourists whispered amongst themselves, pointing fingers at him. Before Ryan could even think about apologizing, or perhaps making a quick escape, movement caught his eye. Security officers stationed nearby sprang into action, rushing toward him with determined strides. Their expressions were grim, and there was no mistaking the seriousness of their intent. "Sir, come with us," one of them said firmly, gripping Ryan's arm before he could protest. Panic bubbled up inside him as he tried to pull away, stammering, Wait. It was just a joke. I didn't mean anything by it." But his words fell on deaf ears. The security team wasn't interested in excuses. They escorted him swiftly out of the square, leaving behind a stunned audience. As Ryan stumbled along, still clutching the empty cone wrapper in his hand, he couldn't help but notice how quiet everything had become. The lively hum of the crowd had vanished, replaced by an eerie calm, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. Once outside the square, Ryan found himself being led into a small office tucked away near the monument. Inside, more officials awaited, their faces stern and unyielding. One of them gestured for him to sit down, pulling out a notepad as if preparing to document every detail of the incident. "Do you understand what you've done?" another officer asked, his tone sharp but controlled. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time since arriving in the city, he felt completely out of his depth. As the interrogation began, Ryan's bravado crumbled under the weight of reality. He realized now that this wasn't just some harmless prank. It was an act of disrespect directed at a national symbol. The guardsmen represented centuries of tradition, discipline, and pride, and Ryan's careless actions had undermined all of that in mere seconds. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. Would they arrest him, deport him, or worse? Meanwhile, back in the square, life slowly returned to normal, but not without lingering tension. Tourists resumed their activities, snapping photos and chatting animatedly, though many couldn't resist stealing glances at the guardsman, who continued his watchful stance as if nothing had occurred. A janitor arrived shortly after to clean up the mess, scrubbing away the remnants of the ice cream with quiet efficiency. Yet despite the cleanup, the memory of the incident lingered in the air, etched into the minds of those who had witnessed it. For Ryan, the gravity of the situation hit hard. What had started as a reckless attempt to inject excitement into his day had spiraled into something far bigger than he'd ever imagined. And as he sat there, surrounded by stern-faced officials, he knew he was about to face consequences that would leave a lasting mark, not just on his trip, but on his life. Ryan sat slumped in the hard wooden chair, his heart pounding like a drum. The small room felt suffocating, its bare walls closing in on him with every passing second. Across the table, two security officers exchanged glances before turning their attention back to him. Their expressions were unreadable, professional but unyielding. One of them leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table as he spoke. "Let's go over this again," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "Why did you throw ice cream at the guardsmen?" Ryan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to explain himself, to make them understand that it wasn't meant to be malicious. It was just stupid, but dumb, impulsive decision born out of boredom and arrogance. But how could he put that into words without sounding even worse? I wasn't thinking," Ryan stammered, avoiding eye contact. "It was supposed to be funny. I didn't mean any harm." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Funny," he repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air. "Do you know what that uniform represents? Do you have any idea how important those guardsmen are to our culture and history?" Ryan shook his head mutely, feeling smaller by the moment. He hadn't thought about any of that when he acted. All he cared about was creating some kind of spectacle, something to break the monotony of his day. The other officer chimed in, his tone sharper this time. You may see it as funny, but your actions are considered deeply disrespectful here. Throwing food at someone in uniform isn't just rude. It's illegal. It's an insult to everything they stand for. Ryan flinched at the word illegal. He had known, deep down, that what he did was wrong, but hearing it framed so seriously made his stomach churn. This wasn't just a slap on the wrist or a scolding. It was real trouble. As the questioning continued, Ryan began to grasp the enormity of his mistake. The officers explained that the guardsman wasn't just standing there idly. He was performing a duty, representing centuries of tradition and honor. To disrupt that, to deface his uniform, was seen as an attack not only on him personally, but also on the values he upheld. People come from all over the world to admire what you disrespected today, one of the officers added, his voice tinged with frustration. And instead of appreciating it, you mocked it. Outside the room, the city buzzed with activity, oblivious to the drama unfolding within these four walls. Tourists snapped photos, street vendors called out their wares, and children laughed as they chased pigeons across the square. Yet here, inside this tiny office, time seemed to drag endlessly. Every question from the officers felt heavier than the last, each word hammering home the seriousness of Ryan's actions. Finally, after what felt like hours, the interrogation ended, or at least paused. The officers stood up, signaling for Ryan to follow them. His legs felt shaky as he rose from the chair, unsure of where they were taking him next. They led him through a series of narrow hallways until they reached a holding area. A stark, cold space with benches lining the walls and fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Here, Ryan was instructed to wait while they processed his case further. Sitting alone on the bench, Ryan buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by guilt and fear. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, cringing at every detail. How had things escalated so quickly? What had started as a reckless attempt to entertain himself had spiraled into a nightmare. He thought about the guardsman again, the way he hadn't reacted, hadn't even blinked when the ice cream hit him. That image stuck with Ryan, haunting him. There had been no anger, no retaliation, just quiet dignity. And now, sitting in this cold, sterile room, Ryan realized just how much respect that deserved. For the first time since arriving in the city, Ryan understood the weight of his actions and the consequences waiting for him outside those doors. The next morning, Ryan found himself seated in a courtroom that felt both intimidating and surreal. The room was small but formal, with wooden benches lining the walls and a raised platform where the judge sat, looking stern and authoritative. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Ryan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together as he tried to steady his breathing. This wasn't how he'd imagined his trip ending, not in a foreign legal system, surrounded by people speaking a language he barely understood. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood up respectfully. As Ryan rose to his feet, he couldn't help but feel like all eyes were on him. His cheeks burned with embarrassment as whispers rippled through the gallery. Some of the attendees were locals who had heard about the incident. Others were curious onlookers eager to see how justice would be served. Ryan avoided meeting anyone's gaze, focusing instead on the floor tiles beneath his shoes. When the judge finally called for everyone to sit, Ryan sank back into his seat, feeling smaller than ever. The proceedings began with a prosecutor outlining the charges against Ryan. Words like public disturbance, defacement of official property, and disrespecting national symbols echoed through the room, each one hitting Ryan like a punch to the gut. He listened intently, though much of it went over his head. Thankfully, a translator assigned to him provided a rough summary, ensuring he understood the gravity of the situation. It became painfully clear that this wasn't just a slap-on-the-wrist scenario. Ryan was facing real consequences, ones that could follow him long after he left the country. When it was Ryan's turn to speak, he hesitated, unsure where to start. His lawyer nudged him gently, encouraging him to address the court. Taking a deep breath, Ryan stood up, his voice trembling as he began. "Your Honor, He started, stumbling over the unfamiliar title. "I want to say, I'm sorry. Truly sorry." He paused, searching for the right words. "I didn't mean to cause harm or disrespect anyone. I thought it was harmless. A stupid joke. But now I realize how wrong I was." The judge studied Ryan carefully, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he leaned forward slightly, addressing Ryan directly. "Do you understand why your actions are considered so offensive?" he asked, his tone measured but firm. Ryan nodded vigorously. "Yes, Your Honor. I've learned that the guardsman represents something much bigger than himself. Tradition, honor, respect. And I disrespected all of that. I didn't know before, but I do now." The judge nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with Ryan's acknowledgement of his mistake. However, he made it clear that ignorance was no excuse. Every visitor has a responsibility to learn about and respect the culture of the place they're visiting, the judge said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "Your behavior not only disrupted public order, but also insulted values cherished by our people. That cannot go unpunished." With those words hanging heavily in the air, the judge delivered his verdict. Ryan was fined a substantial amount, money he hadn't planned to spend during his travels, and given a 5-year ban from returning to the country. Additionally, the court ordered him to write a formal letter of apology, which would be shared publicly as part of his punishment. Though spared jail time due to his lack of prior offenses, the weight of the sentence crushed Ryan. He felt the fine deeply. It meant dipping into savings he couldn't afford to lose. But the travel ban stung even more. 5 years might as well have been a lifetime. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Ryan slumped back into his seat, overwhelmed by shame and regret. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited eagerly, cameras flashing as he emerged. Questions flew at him from every direction. What were you thinking? Do you think the punishment fits the crime? How does it feel to be banned from the country? Ryan kept his head down, shielding his face with his hand as he hurried past them, desperate to escape the spotlight. Back at his hotel later that evening, Ryan replayed the day's events in his mind. The courtroom, the judge's words, the reporter's questions, it all swirled together in a blur of guilt and self-loathing. He realized now that his actions had consequences far beyond what he'd anticipated. What had seemed like a harmless prank had spiraled into a life-altering lesson, one he would carry with him forever. By the time Ryan returned to his home country, news of the incident had already spread like wildfire. Social media platforms were ablaze with posts about the tourist who threw ice cream at a guardsman. Videos of the moment captured by bystanders went viral, racking up millions of views within hours. Memes mocking Ryan popped up everywhere, some funny, others cruel. There was even a cartoon caricature of him holding an oversized ice cream cone, standing next to a stoic guardsman. While some people found humor in it, many comments were harsh and unforgiving. "Who does something this dumb?" one user wrote. Another added, "Hope he learned his lesson." But not everyone condemned Ryan outright. A small yet vocal group argued that punishing him so severely was excessive for what they saw as a harmless prank. They pointed out that tourists often make mistakes due to ignorance or cultural differences, and while Ryan's actions were disrespectful, they didn't justify such heavy consequences. These voices sparked heated debates online, dividing opinions between those who believed in strict accountability and others who advocated for leniency. Meanwhile, back in the city where the incident occurred, the guardsman became an unexpected hero. Local newspapers published articles praising his composure and professionalism, calling him a symbol of dignity under pressure. People admired how he hadn't reacted despite being humiliated in front of hundreds of onlookers. Some even started referring to him as the ice cream guardsman. Though always respectfully, his image appeared on posters promoting national pride, and children began mimicking his stance during school plays. The monument where the incident took place also gained newfound attention, drawing more visitors eager to see the site of the infamous event. For Ryan, however, life became increasingly difficult. Friends and family bombarded him with questions as soon as he stepped off the plane. "What were you thinking?" his mother asked, her voice laced with disappointment. Even his coworkers heard about the scandal. Awkward silences followed whenever someone brought it up at work. Ryan tried to brush it off, insisting it was all blown out of proportion. But deep down, he knew better. Every meme, every comment, every raised eyebrow served as a reminder of his mistake, and there seemed to be no escape. To make matters worse, Ryan struggled financially because of the hefty fine imposed by the court. He had drained most of his savings to pay it off, leaving little room for comfort. Bills piled up, adding stress to an already overwhelming situation. At night, he lay awake replaying the incident over and over in his mind, wondering how things might have turned out differently if he'd simply walked away instead of acting impulsively. Despite the backlash, Ryan couldn't ignore the fact that his story had sparked important conversations about tourism and cultural sensitivity. Travel bloggers and influencers weighed in, urging their followers to educate themselves before visiting foreign countries. "It's not enough to pack your bags and board a plane," one popular travel vlogger said in a video addressing the incident. "You need to understand the rules, traditions, and values of the places you visit. Otherwise, you risk offending people, or worse." Even schools incorporated the story into lessons about global citizenship, using it as a cautionary tale about respecting other cultures. Teachers encouraged students to think critically about their behavior when traveling abroad, emphasizing that actions perceived as harmless in one culture could carry significant weight in another. For better or worse, Ryan's name became synonymous with these discussions, a constant reminder of the importance of mindfulness and humility. While some parts of the public outrage died down after a few weeks, Ryan knew the memory of what happened would linger far longer. Every notification on his phone, every headline scrolling across the news, felt like a fresh wound reopening. Yet, amidst the chaos, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn this negative experience into something meaningful. But first, he needed to figure out how to move forward without letting the past define him completely. Months passed, and the initial frenzy surrounding Ryan's actions began to fade, at least for everyone else. For Ryan, however, the weight of what he'd done lingered like a shadow. He couldn't scroll through social media without stumbling upon memes or comments about the infamous ice cream incident. Even in his day-to-day life, he felt judged, as if people could see the words "troublemaker" tattooed on his forehead. It wasn't just guilt that haunted him. It was the realization that his reckless decision had consequences far beyond himself. It had hurt others, tarnished reputations, and sparked outrage across cultures. One quiet evening, while sitting alone in his apartment, Ryan decided he couldn't keep running from the truth. He opened his laptop and typed a simple phrase into the search bar: "How to make amends for cultural disrespect." The results led him down a rabbit hole of articles, videos, and forums discussing responsible tourism, cross-cultural understanding, and ways to repair damaged relationships. One article stood out, a story about a traveler who had offended locals during their trip, but later worked hard to rebuild trust by volunteering with organizations promoting cultural exchange. Inspired, Ryan realized he didn't have to remain stuck in shame forever. There was still a chance to do something positive, even if it wouldn't erase the past. The next morning, Ryan reached out to a local nonprofit focused on educating tourists about cultural sensitivity. At first, they were hesitant to involve someone associated with such controversy, but Ryan's sincerity won them over. He began attending workshops, learning firsthand about the importance of respecting traditions, symbols, and rituals unique to different countries. Slowly, he started sharing his own experiences, admitting his mistakes openly, and urging others not to repeat them. His vulnerability resonated with participants, many of whom admitted they too had made blunders while traveling but never fully understood why those actions mattered so much. Encouraged by the feedback, Ryan took another step, writing an open letter addressed to the public. In it, he expressed deep regret for his behavior, acknowledging how ignorant and selfish he had been. "I thought I was being clever, He wrote, "But all I did was show a lack of respect for something incredibly important. I failed to recognize the significance of the guardsman's role and the values he represented. For that, I will always be sorry." He posted the letter online, bracing himself for backlash. To his surprise, the response was mixed but leaning toward forgiveness. Some dismissed his apology as insincere or too late, accusing him of seeking attention. Others, however, appreciated his honesty and willingness to grow. A few even thanked him for sparking conversations they might not have had otherwise. Among the replies was a message from the guardsman himself, or at least someone claiming to speak on his behalf. The note was brief but impactful. "Mistakes can teach us valuable lessons. Learn from this and move forward." Ryan printed out the message and pinned it to his bulletin board, where he could see it every day. It became a source of motivation, reminding him that redemption wasn't impossible, even after making monumental errors. With renewed determination, he continued volunteering, speaking at schools, and participating in community events aimed at fostering mutual respect between cultures. Each opportunity allowed him to confront his guilt head-on, transforming it into fuel for change. Though the scars of the incident remained, both personally and publicly, Ryan began to feel a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. What started as a moment of recklessness had evolved into a journey of self-reflection and growth. And while the road ahead was long, Ryan knew he was finally heading in the right direction. Years rolled by, and Ryan's life transformed in ways he never could have predicted. The once careless traveler had become a vocal advocate for responsible tourism, dedicating himself to helping others avoid the same mistakes he'd made. His journey wasn't easy. There were days when the weight of his past actions still pressed heavily on him. But with each passing year, he grew more confident in his mission. It wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about proving that people can learn, grow, and contribute positively, even after failing spectacularly. Ryan started visiting schools and community centers, sharing his story with groups of students, teachers, and travelers. Standing before audiences, he would recount the events of that fateful day in vivid detail: the ice cream, the guardsman's stoic expression, the gasps of the crowd, and the crushing realization that followed. He didn't sugarcoat anything. Instead, he painted an honest picture of how recklessness and ignorance had led him down a path of public shame and legal trouble. "I'm not here to excuse my behavior," he'd say, looking directly into the eyes of his listeners. "What I did was wrong, plain and simple. But I am here to tell you that mistakes don't have to define you. You can choose to learn from them." His talk struck a chord with many, especially young people who were preparing for their first trips abroad. Students would approach him after presentations, asking questions like, "How do I know if something is offensive?" Or, "What should I do if I accidentally disrespect someone?" Ryan welcomed these conversations, offering practical advice: research before traveling, ask questions respectfully, observe local customs, and always err on the side of caution. "It's okay not to know everything," he'd assure them, "but it's not okay to act without thinking. Take the time to understand where you're going. It shows respect." Word of Ryan's advocacy work spread, leading to invitations to speak at larger events, including international travel conferences. At one such conference, he stood on stage alongside seasoned experts discussing global citizenship and cultural exchange. As he shared his personal story, the audience listened intently, moved by his sincerity. When he finished speaking, the room erupted in applause, a moment that left Ryan feeling both humbled and hopeful. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen. Not as the guy who threw ice cream at a guardsman, but as someone using his experience to make a difference. In addition to speaking engagements, Ryan collaborated with travel organizations to create educational resources for tourists. Together, they developed guides and videos highlighting common cultural pitfalls and offering tips for respectful interactions. One project, titled "Before You Go," became particularly popular, earning praise from educators and travelers alike. Through these efforts, Ryan found a sense of fulfillment he'd never experienced before. Helping others navigate the complexities of cross-cultural understanding gave his life new meaning. Despite the progress he made, Ryan knew there would always be critics. Some dismissed his transformation as performative, accusing him of trying to profit off his mistake. Others argued that no amount of good deeds could undo the harm he caused. Ryan acknowledged their concerns, knowing he couldn't please everyone. What mattered most to him was staying true to his commitment, to honor the lessons he'd learned and continue spreading awareness, one conversation at a time. As he stood on stage at yet another event, reflecting on how far he'd come, Ryan realized something profound. The incident that had once defined him had ultimately reshaped him into someone better. It hadn't been easy, but every challenge along the way had pushed him closer to becoming the person he wanted to be. And though the memory of that day would always linger, it no longer weighed him down. Instead, it served as a reminder of the power of humility, growth, and second chances. Years later, Ryan stood in the same bustling city square where everything had changed for him. The cobblestones beneath his feet felt familiar, though the air carried a different energy now. Gone were the whispers of judgment or the lingering stares of disapproval. Instead, he walked among the crowd unnoticed, just another face in the sea of tourists, snapping photos and marveling at the historic monuments. This time, however, Ryan wasn't there to sightsee. He had returned, not as the reckless young man who once hurled ice cream at a guardsman, but as someone determined to honor the lessons he'd learned. As he approached the towering monument where the infamous incident had taken place, Ryan paused, taking a moment to reflect. The memory of that day came rushing back. The sticky dessert splattering across the pristine uniform, the stunned silence of the crowd, the weight of the guardsman's unflinching gaze. It all seemed so vivid, yet distant now, like a chapter from another life. Standing there, Ryan felt a deep sense of gratitude. For the guardsman's composure, for the people who had challenged him to grow, and for the second chance he'd worked so hard to earn. Nearby, a group of travelers gathered around a tour guide, listening intently as she explained the significance of the monument. Ryan smiled faintly, noticing how carefully they listened, nodding along as she spoke about its history and cultural importance. "This place holds meaning," the guide emphasized, her voice warm but firm. "When you visit landmarks like this, remember to show respect. It's not just stone and metal. It's a symbol of identity and pride." Her words resonated deeply with Ryan, reminding him why his actions years ago had been so offensive. He lingered nearby for a while, observing the interactions between the guide and her audience, silently appreciating their curiosity and attentiveness. Later that afternoon, Ryan attended a small ceremony honoring local efforts to promote cross-cultural understanding. Organizers invited him to speak briefly, acknowledging his role in raising awareness about responsible tourism. As he stepped up to the podium, his heart raced, not with fear this time, but with purpose. Looking out at the diverse crowd, he began by thanking them for allowing him to share his story. "I came here years ago thinking I knew what travel was all about," he said, his voice steady. "But I left realizing I had so much more to learn. Today, I stand before you not because I'm perfect, but because I believe we can all do better." His speech earned heartfelt applause, and afterward, several attendees approached him to thank him personally. One woman, a teacher leading a group of students on an educational trip, shared how his story had inspired her class to research cultural practices before embarking on their journey. Another man recounted his own experience of accidentally offending locals during a vacation, admitting he'd since become more mindful thanks to Ryan's advocacy work. These moments filled Ryan with hope, reinforcing the idea that even the smallest efforts could create ripples of change. Before leaving the city, Ryan made one final stop, a quiet corner near the monument where he left a handwritten note tucked inside a folded piece of paper. Addressed to the guardsman, it read simply, "Thank you for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget. Your dignity changed my life." He didn't expect a response, nor did he need one. Writing those words felt like closing a chapter, leaving behind the pain and regret that had once consumed him. Back home, Ryan continued his mission, speaking at events, mentoring young travelers, and collaborating with organizations dedicated to fostering global understanding. Though the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined him. Instead, they served as reminders of the power of humility, accountability, and growth. And somewhere in that city square, the guardsman continued his watchful stance, standing tall as a living testament to the values Ryan now championed. A legacy etched in history for all who dared to challenge it, only to emerge stronger on the other side.